3 years ago, 14-year-old Emily Robinson disappeared during what should have been a simple afternoon with friends in Central Park, New York. The overweight teenager, known for her gentle smile and love for reading under the old oak trees, vanished without a trace on October 15, 2010. Her disappearance plunged the Robinson family into unimaginable grief and sent shockwaves through their Upper West Side community. The NYPD considered multiple possibilities: runaway, abduction, accident. But despite extensive searches involving helicopters, dive teams, and hundreds of volunteers, they found nothing. The case grew cold, leaving Emily's parents, Margaret and David Robinson, consumed by anguish and desperate for answers. Fighting against a system that seemed ready to forget their daughter, they never lost hope that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. Antes de seguir, inscreva-se e ative o sininho. Aqui a gente reabre casos arquivados com respeito e prova. October 15, 2010, started like any typical Saturday for the Robinson family. Emily had finished her morning chores and asked permission to meet her friends Jessica Martinez and Tyler Chen at Bethesda Fountain. Margaret Robinson, a school librarian, remember hesitating. Emily had been dealing with bullying at school because of her weight, and social outings sometimes ended in tears. But seeing her daughter's hopeful expression, she relented. "Be back by 6 p.m., she told Emily, watching her 14-year-old walk toward the subway station with her worn backpack and favorite purple jacket. The three friends met as planned around 2 p.m. According to Jessica and Tyler's later testimonies to police, they spent time feeding ducks near the reservoir and taking photos by Bow Bridge. Emily seemed happy, more relaxed than she'd been in weeks. Around 4:30 p.m., the group decided to explore the wooded areas near the North Woods, a section of the park known for its secluded trails and dense foliage. Jessica later told investigators that Emily had mentioned wanting to find a quiet spot to read. She always carried a book, usually fantasy novels about brave heroines. As they walked deeper into the woods, the afternoon light began to fade. Tyler received a text from his mother demanding he come home immediately. Jessica decided to leave with him, but Emily insisted on staying a little longer. "I found the perfect reading spot," she told them, pointing toward a cluster of large boulders near a small stream. Those were the last words anyone would hear Emily Robinson speak. When Emily failed to return home by 6 p.m., Margaret Robinson felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. By 8 p.m., when calls to Emily's cell phone went straight to voicemail, she and David were driving to Central Park. By 10 p.m., they had contacted the police. The initial response was frustratingly routine. Teenage runaways were common, they were told. Wait 24 hours. But Margaret Robinson knew her daughter. Emily wasn't rebellious or impulsive. She was responsible, perhaps too responsible for a 14-year-old. She helped care for their aging golden retriever, Max, and never missed family dinners. Something was terribly wrong, and with each passing hour, Margaret's maternal instinct screamed louder than the dismissive voices of authority. The first official search began at dawn on October 16th. Park rangers, police officers, and volunteers combed through Emily's last known location near the North Woods. They found her backpack caught on a bramble bush about 50 yards from where Jessica and Tyler last saw her. But the book she'd been carrying, The Chronicles of Narnia, was missing. Her cell phone was discovered in the reservoir 3 days later, water damaged beyond recovery. Detective Sarah Mitchell, assigned to lead the investigation, quickly realized this wasn't a typical runaway case. Emily's social media accounts showed no signs of planning to leave home. Her bank account remained untouched. Most telling was her relationship with Max, her golden retriever. Emily would never abandon him willingly. The dog had been pacing anxiously since her disappearance, whimpering by the front door and refusing to eat. As weeks turned into months, the Robinson family watched helplessly as media attention faded and the investigation stalled. Margaret took leave from her job to organize search parties, while David, a construction foreman, spent weekends posting missing person flyers throughout Manhattan. Their marriage began showing strain under the weight of unanswered questions and endless waiting. The community initially rallied around them: candlelight vigils, fundraisers for reward money, social media campaigns. But gradually, as hope dimmed and leads dried up, people moved on with their lives. Only the Robinsons remained frozen in time, trapped in that terrible October afternoon when their daughter walked into Central Park and never came home. The NYPD's investigation into Emily Robinson's disappearance revealed a disturbing pattern of oversights and missed opportunities that would haunt the case for years. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, found herself fighting against bureaucratic indifference and dwindling resources as Emily's case competed with hundreds of other open files in the precinct. The initial 72-hour window, crucial in missing person investigations, had been partially wasted due to the department's standard protocol of treating teenage disappearances as potential runaways. By the time the full investigation machinery activated, vital evidence had already been compromised. Crime scene tape hadn't been established around Emily's last known location until day 3, allowing countless park visitors to contaminate the area. Mitchell's team conducted extensive interviews with Emily's classmates at Manhattan East Middle School, where a troubling picture emerged. Emily had been subjected to persistent bullying, primarily focused on her weight. Students described incidents of cruel notes left in her locker, mocking comments during lunch, and deliberate exclusion from group activities. The school's anti-bullying policies existed on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent at best. "She was an easy target," admitted one classmate during questioning. "Emily was quiet, didn't fight back, and her parents weren't the type to make scenes at school." This revelation devastated Margaret and David Robinson, who had been unaware of the extent of their daughter's social struggles. Emily had been protecting them from the truth, bearing her pain in silence. Jessica Martinez and Tyler Chen, Emily's companions that final day, underwent multiple interviews and polygraph tests. Both passed without incident, their stories remaining consistent under pressure. Jessica broke down during her third interview, sobbing as she revealed Emily's recent comments about feeling invisible and wondering if anyone would notice if she simply disappeared. The detective noted this statement with growing concern. Was Emily's disappearance voluntary after all? The investigation expanded to include known sex offenders within a 5-mile radius of Central Park. 17 registered individuals were questioned and cleared through alibis and DNA testing. Mitchell also explored the possibility of online predators, examining Emily's internet history and social media accounts with forensic specialists. They found nothing suspicious. Emily's online presence was remarkably innocent, consisting mainly of book reviews and photos of her dog. Central Park's surveillance system provided another source of frustration for investigators. While the park had numerous security cameras, many were positioned at entrances and major landmarks, leaving vast areas unmonitored. The footage they recovered showed Emily, Jessica, and Tyler entering the park at 2:17 p.m., but the trio quickly moved into camera-blind zones. No footage captured Emily alone or showed any suspicious individuals following the group. Margaret Robinson became increasingly critical of the investigation's direction. She hired private investigator Robert Kane, a former NYPD detective, to conduct an independent parallel investigation. Kane's experience with similar cases led him to focus on Emily's emotional state and potential suicide risk. A possibility the Robinson family vehemently rejected, but one that explained the lack of physical evidence. The search efforts evolved from emergency response to methodical grid searches. Volunteer groups organized by Margaret Robinson scoured Central Park every weekend for months. They expanded their search radius to include Riverside Park, Morningside Park, and even ventured into abandoned buildings throughout Manhattan. The faithful golden retriever Max often accompanied these searches, though he showed no particular interest or recognition at any location. As winter approached, the case faced its first major setback. Budget constraints forced the NYPD to reduce the number of officers assigned to Emily's case. Detective Mitchell found herself juggling 6 other active investigations, limiting her ability to pursue new leads. The Robinson family's weekly meetings with police became monthly, then quarterly, as official hope for a break in the case diminished. The media attention that had initially spotlighted Emily's disappearance began to wane as newer tragedies captured public interest. Margaret Robinson watched in horror as her daughter's story was gradually forgotten by everyone except those who loved her. Local news stations stopped returning her calls, and the missing person flyers she faithfully replaced each week were increasingly ignored by passers-by who had grown accustomed to seeing Emily's smiling face on telephone poles and community bulletin boards. By spring 2011, the harsh reality set in. Emily Robinson had become another statistic, another cold case file in an overwhelmed system. But Margaret Robinson refused to accept defeat, transforming her grief into determination that would sustain her through the dark years ahead. The months following Emily's disappearance transformed the Robinson household into a shrine of suspended time and suffocating grief. Margaret Robinson, once an organized and cheerful school librarian, became consumed by her daughter's case, converting Emily's bedroom into an impromptu command center filled with maps, photographs, and carefully organized leads that led nowhere. David Robinson watched helplessly as his wife of 18 years disappeared into an obsession that threatened to destroy what remained of their family. Margaret's days began at 4 a.m., checking missing person databases and cold case forums, then shifted to coordinating volunteer searches and badgering police detectives who grew increasingly reluctant to take her calls. She lost 30 pounds in the first 6 months, her frame becoming as fragile as her mental state. The couple's communication deteriorated into arguments about resources and priorities. David wanted to accept the possibility that Emily was gone forever and begin the healing process, but Margaret interpreted any suggestion of moving forward as betrayal. "You want to forget her," she would scream during their increasingly frequent fights. "You want to pretend our daughter never existed." David would retreat to his workshop in the garage, where he built furniture with methodical precision, the only activity that quieted his racing thoughts. Max, Emily's golden retriever, became both comfort and torture for the family. The aging dog would spend hours lying by the front door, ears perked for sounds that never came. His mournful whining filled the house at unexpected moments, triggering fresh waves of grief. Margaret found herself talking to Max about Emily, describing their search efforts and promising they would find her soon. David worried that his wife was losing her grip on reality. The financial strain of the investigation added another layer of stress to their crumbling marriage. Margaret had taken unpaid leave from her job, while David worked overtime to pay for private investigators, reward money, and the endless costs of keeping Emily's case active. Their savings account dwindled as they paid for forensic consultants, psychics, and anyone who claimed they might help find their daughter. Friends and extended family initially provided strong support, organizing meal trains and helping with search efforts. But as months stretched into years with no progress, even the most devoted supporters began to distance themselves. Margaret's sister Linda, once her closest confidant, admitted she could no longer handle Margaret's single-minded focus on Emily's case. "You're scaring everyone away," Linda told her during a tearful confrontation. "We want to help, but you won't talk about anything else." The Robinson marriage reached its breaking point during Emily's 15th birthday in March 2011. Margaret had planned an elaborate celebration for when Emily comes home, complete with a cake and presents. David's suggestion that they hold a memorial service instead triggered the most violent argument of their marriage. Margaret threw Emily's birthday cake against the kitchen wall and accused David of giving up on their daughter. That night, David slept in his office for the first time, beginning a pattern that would define their relationship. Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic as the first anniversary of Emily's disappearance approached. She claimed to receive signs from Emily through various sources, license plates with meaningful numbers, songs on the radio, even the way Max positioned himself in certain rooms. She joined online support groups for families of missing children, but her aggressive insistence that Emily was still alive alienated other members who had accepted their own losses. Detective Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator, grew concerned about Margaret's psychological state during their meetings. Margaret would arrive with elaborate theories and connections that existed only in her desperate mind. She accused Mitchell of not caring enough, of being lazy, of deliberately sabotaging the investigation. These confrontations became so uncomfortable that Mitchell began requesting a supervisor's presence during meetings with the Robinson family. The second anniversary brought a new level of desperation to Margaret's behavior. She hired 3 different psychics, all of whom provided contradictory information about Emily's fate. She also began following suspicious individuals in Central Park, convinced she could identify Emily's abductor through intuition alone. David hired a therapist to intervene, but Margaret refused to attend sessions, claiming that therapy was giving up on Emily. As 2012 progressed, the Robinson house took on the atmosphere of a mausoleum. Margaret refused to change anything in Emily's room, insisting their daughter would need her belongings when she returned. Emily's bed remained made, with the same sheets from October 2010. Her school backpack sat ready by the door. Even her toothbrush remained in its holder, waiting for her return. David found himself caught between love for his wife and the need to preserve his own sanity. He began attending grief counseling sessions alone, where he learned that Margaret's behavior, while extreme, was not uncommon among parents of missing children. The counselor explained that accepting uncertainty was often more difficult than accepting death. At least, death provided closure and the ability to mourn properly. The isolation became complete when Margaret accused their closest friends of betrayal for suggesting they plan a memorial service for Emily. She couldn't understand why everyone seemed ready to give up when she remained convinced that Emily was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. This conviction, while keeping her functioning, also prevented any possibility of healing or moving forward with her life. By 2013, Emily Robinson's case had become one of hundreds of cold files gathering dust in the NYPD's Missing Persons Archive. The initial urgency had long since faded, replaced by the grim reality that most missing person cases either resolve quickly or remain forever unsolved. Detective Sarah Mitchell, promoted to supervising detective, occasionally reviewed Emily's file but had no new leads to pursue. The Robinson family had fractured beyond recognition. David finally moved out in January 2013, unable to watch his wife's continued deterioration. He rented a small apartment near his construction site, visiting the house twice weekly to check on Margaret and Max. Their conversations were stilted and painful, focusing mainly on practical matters like mortgage payments and Max's veterinary care. Margaret's obsession had evolved into a methodical routine that gave her days structure while isolating her from the living world. She maintained extensive spreadsheets, tracking every missing person case in the tri-state area, convinced that Emily's disappearance was connected to a larger pattern. Her walls were covered with maps marked with colored pins, representing various theories and potential connections that made sense only to her traumatized mind. The once social librarian now rarely left her house except for weekly visits to Central Park, where she would spend hours walking the same paths Emily had traveled that final day. Park rangers knew her by sight and treated her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She carried recent photos of Emily, asking joggers and dog walkers if they'd seen anything suspicious 3 years earlier, as if memory could be jogged by her persistent questioning. Max, now 11 years old, had developed health problems that worried David, but seemed invisible to Margaret. The golden retriever moved slowly, his joints stiff with arthritis. but Margaret insisted on bringing him to Central Park for their weekly searches. She believed Max held the key to finding Emily, interpreting his behavior for signs and messages that existed only in her desperate imagination. The media had long since moved on to fresher tragedies. Emily's case received brief mention on the anniversary of her disappearance, a 30-second segment on local news showing Margaret's increasingly gaunt face pleading for information. These annual reminders served mainly to highlight how little progress had been made and how completely Emily had been forgotten by the outside world. Private investigator Robert Kane had terminated his contract with the Robinsons in late 2012, frustrated by Margaret's refusal to consider any scenario except ongoing abduction. His final report, delivered gently but firmly, concluded that Emily had most likely died within hours of her disappearance, either by accident or suicide. Margaret rejected these findings entirely, accusing Kane of taking her money while secretly believing Emily was dead. The financial devastation was complete by 2013. Medical bills for Margaret's anxiety medication and therapy sessions she rarely attended, combined with the costs of maintaining their house on David's single income, had drained their savings. David worked 70-hour weeks, grateful for the physical exhaustion that prevented him from thinking too deeply about his shattered family. Margaret's few remaining friends made periodic attempts to reconnect, usually around holidays or Emily's birthday. These visits were exercises in futility, as Margaret could only discuss her theories about Emily's case. She would show visitors her elaborate filing system, her correspondence with other families of missing children, and her detailed analysis of Central Park's layout. Former colleagues from the library stopped calling after Margaret accused them of not caring enough about Emily to help with her searches. The house itself became a physical manifestation of suspended grief, mail piled up unopened unless it related to Emily's case. Housework went undone except in Emily's room, which Margaret cleaned obsessively twice weekly. The kitchen was stocked mainly with protein bars and instant coffee. Margaret had lost the ability to cook proper meals or maintain normal routines. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Margaret's therapist, documented the classic signs of complicated grief in her patient files. Margaret's inability to accept uncertainty about Emily's fate prevented any progress toward healing. The therapist's notes described Margaret as emotionally frozen in October 2010, with no capacity to process her loss or imagine a future without Emily. Central Park itself had moved on from Emily's disappearance. New construction projects modified some pathways, seasonal changes altered the landscape, and millions of visitors created new memories in spaces that Margaret still saw as crime scenes. The boulder where Emily was last seen now served as a resting spot for tourists, who were unaware they were sitting where a 14-year-old girl had vanished into thin air. Max's behavior during their park visits had become increasingly lethargic, but Margaret interpreted his reluctance to search as emotional distress over Emily's absence. She would encourage him to find Emily and praise him when he showed interest in particular locations, not recognizing that his aging body simply needed rest. The dog that had once bounded through the park now walked slowly beside his obsessed owner, a faithful companion in an endless search for a girl who existed now only in memory. As October 2013 approached, marking 3 years since Emily's disappearance, Margaret prepared for another anniversary vigil in Central Park. She had no way of knowing that this anniversary would finally bring the break she had prayed for, though not in any way she could have imagined. October 15th, 2013, exactly 3 years after Emily Robinson's disappearance, began like every other anniversary for Margaret Robinson. She woke before dawn, dressed in the same black sweater she wore for every park visit, and prepared for another day of searching in Central Park. Max, now moving with the careful steps of an elderly dog, seemed reluctant to make their usual journey, but Margaret gently coaxed him into his leash. The morning air carried an autumn chill that reminded Margaret painfully of that last day with Emily. She had planned to spend the anniversary alone with Max, walking Emily's final known route and placing flowers at the boulder where her daughter was last seen. What she didn't expect was that this day would finally provide the answer she had desperately sought for 3 years. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been assigned to patrol Central Park that morning, primarily to ensure Margaret Robinson didn't create any disturbances during her anniversary vigil. The department had grown concerned about Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior during these visits, and Mitchell's presence was meant to be preventative rather than investigative. Margaret and Max entered the park through the same entrance Emily had used 3 years earlier. Max moved slowly, pausing frequently to rest, his breathing labored from the walk. Margaret, lost in her memories and grief, barely noticed her aging companion's distress as they made their way toward the Northwoods section, where Emily had vanished. As they approached the familiar boulder, Max suddenly stopped walking entirely. Margaret turned back to encourage him forward, but the golden retriever was staring intently at a dense thicket of bushes about 30 yards from Emily's last known location. For the first time in months, Max showed genuine alertness. His ears perked forward, and his tail wagging slowly. "What is it, boy?" Margaret whispered, her heart racing with sudden hope. Max had never shown particular interest in this area during their previous searches. The dog began pulling toward the bushes with more energy than he had displayed in months, whimpering softly as he strained against his leash. Margaret followed Max through the undergrowth, pushing aside branches and brambles that scratched her arms and caught her clothing. The area was difficult to access, which explained why previous searches might have overlooked it. Max's behavior became increasingly excited as they penetrated deeper into the thicket. His nose pressed close to the ground as he followed a scent invisible to human senses. Detective Mitchell, observing from a distance, initially planned to intervene if Margaret became too agitated. But Max's unusual behavior caught her attention, and her professional instincts kicked in. She radioed for backup and began making her way toward the Robinson woman and her dog, unsure what they might be discovering, but recognizing that something significant was happening. 20 feet into the thicket, Max suddenly sat down and began pawing at a small depression in the ground, partially concealed by fallen leaves and accumulated debris from 3 years of seasonal changes. Margaret knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she began clearing away the natural camouflage. What she uncovered made her gasp and stumble backward. Partially buried beneath years of leaves and soil was a distinctive purple fabric, the same shade as Emily's favorite jacket, the one she had been wearing the day she disappeared. But this wasn't just a piece of clothing blown by wind and buried by time. The fabric appeared to have been deliberately placed and covered, suggesting human intervention rather than natural dispersal. Detective Mitchell arrived just as Margaret was uncovering the purple material. Recognizing the potential significance of the discovery, Mitchell immediately secured the area and called for the crime scene unit. Max continued to paw at the ground around the fabric, whimpering and showing signs of distress that his advanced age hadn't displayed in years. "Don't touch anything else," Mitchell instructed Margaret, who was sobbing and reaching toward what appeared to be Emily's jacket. "This is now a crime scene. We need to process everything properly." Margaret nodded through her tears, clutching Max's leash as the dog continued to show agitation at the sight. Within an hour, Central Park was swarming with police activity for the first time since Emily's initial disappearance. Crime scene technicians carefully excavated the area around the purple fabric, documenting every detail with photographs and measurements. What they found beneath Emily's jacket would change everything the Robinson family thought they knew about their daughter's fate. Buried 18 inches below the surface, wrapped in plastic bags that had prevented complete decomposition, were Emily's missing book, The Chronicles of Narnia, along with her house keys, a silver bracelet Margaret had given her for her 14th birthday, and most shocking of all, a handwritten note that appeared to be in Emily's own handwriting. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If these items had been buried deliberately, it suggested that Emily's disappearance wasn't a random abduction or accident. Someone had taken time to carefully conceal evidence in a location that wouldn't be found through normal search procedures. The question that haunted everyone present was whether Emily had hidden these items herself before something happened to her, or whether someone else had buried them after her disappearance. Margaret Robinson collapsed to her knees beside Max, who was now lying down from exhaustion but still alert and focused on the excavation site. 3 years of desperate searching had finally yielded results, but the discovery raised more questions than answers about what had happened to Emily on that October afternoon in 2010. The handwritten note discovered with Emily's buried belongings sent shockwaves through the investigation team and provided the first concrete clue in 3 years of searching. Written in Emily's distinctive curved handwriting on a page torn from her copy of The Chronicles of Narnia, the message was brief but chilling. If something happens to me, look for the truth in the place where we used to feed the ducks. Trust no one from school. Detective Sarah Mitchell immediately recognized the significance of this discovery. Emily had anticipated danger and taken steps to leave a message, but the note's cryptic nature suggested she either didn't know specifically who threatened her or didn't have time to write more detailed information. The reference to the place where we used to feed the ducks could only mean Bethesda Fountain, where Emily had met Jessica and Tyler on the day she disappeared. The crime scene unit spent 12 hours meticulously processing the burial site. Advanced forensic techniques revealed that the items had been buried within 24 to 48 hours of Emily's disappearance, based on soil compression patterns and organic matter analysis. More disturbing was the discovery of additional DNA evidence on the plastic bags, traces that didn't match Emily or any family members. Margaret Robinson was simultaneously devastated and vindicated by the discovery. For 3 years, people had suggested Emily might have run away or committed suicide, theories Margaret had vehemently rejected. Now they had proof that Emily had been in genuine danger and had tried to leave clues for her family to find. The note proved Emily had been planning to return home and had taken precautions against an unknown threat. David Robinson rushed to the park when Mitchell called him about the discovery. Seeing his wife collapse beside Max, clutching Emily's purple jacket, broke through 3 years of emotional numbness. For the first time since their separation, David and Margaret clung to each other, united in their grief and their renewed hope that they might finally learn the truth about their daughter's fate. The investigation was officially reopened, with Emily's case receiving the highest priority classification. Detective Mitchell assembled a new task force, including FBI specialists in adolescent psychology and forensic linguistics, who could analyze Emily's note for additional clues about her state of mind and the nature of the threat she perceived. The reference to "trust no one from school" immediately focused attention back on Emily's middle school and the bullying incidents that had been documented during the original investigation. Mitchell ordered fresh interviews with all of Emily's classmates, teachers, and school staff, particularly focusing on anyone who had access to Emily's daily routine and might have known about her weekend plans. Jessica Martinez and Tyler Chen were re-interviewed extensively about their final day with Emily. Under renewed pressure and with 3 years of maturity since the original questioning, Jessica broke down and revealed information she had withheld from the original investigation. Emily had received threatening text messages in the weeks before her disappearance, messages that Emily had deleted but had described to Jessica as someone from school saying they were going to hurt me. The forensic analysis of Emily's note revealed additional disturbing details. The handwriting showed signs of stress and fear, irregular letter formations and pressure variations consistent with someone writing under extreme emotional duress. Linguistic experts noted that Emily's usually elaborate vocabulary was reduced to simple, urgent phrases, suggesting she had written the note quickly while in a heightened state of anxiety. Max's role in the discovery became a source of both wonder and investigation. Animal behavior specialists consulted on the case explained that dogs can detect scent traces for years under the right conditions, and Max's strong bond with Emily would have made him particularly sensitive to any trace of her presence. The fact that he had never shown interest in this location during previous searches suggested that environmental factors, wind patterns, seasonal changes or ground disturbance, had finally brought Emily's scent to the surface after 3 years. The location of the burial site also provided crucial information. The spot was visible from the boulder where Emily was last seen, but required local knowledge to access through the dense undergrowth. Someone familiar with Central Park's layout had chosen this location specifically because it wouldn't be found during standard search procedures, but could potentially be discovered by someone looking for clues Emily might have left. Margaret Robinson's behavior underwent a dramatic transformation following the discovery. The frantic, obsessive energy that had consumed her for 3 years was replaced by a focused determination. Emily's note proved that her daughter had been thinking of her family and trying to protect them even in her final moments. This evidence validated everything Margaret had believed about Emily's character and her conviction that her daughter hadn't abandoned them voluntarily. The media attention surrounding the discovery brought renewed focus to Emily's case, but also unwanted scrutiny of the original investigation's shortcomings. Questions arose about why this area hadn't been thoroughly searched in 2010, and whether earlier discovery of Emily's note might have led to a different outcome. Detective Mitchell found herself defending her team's procedures while simultaneously pursuing new leads generated by the evidence. The DNA traces found on the plastic bags were entered into national databases, but initial searches yielded no matches. However, forensic experts were optimistic that the genetic material was sufficient for comparison testing once a suspect was identified. The bags themselves were common household items available at any grocery store, providing no immediate leads about their source. Emily's note had transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a likely homicide inquiry, though her body still hadn't been found. The deliberate burial of her belongings suggested that someone had wanted to ensure these items would eventually be discovered, possibly as part of an elaborate psychological game or an attempt to manipulate the investigation's direction. As the task force prepared to follow Emily's cryptic clue to Bethesda Fountain, they knew they were finally on the trail of answers that had eluded them for 3 long years. Emily's cryptic reference to the place where we used to feed the ducks led Detective Sarah Mitchell's task force to conduct an intensive examination of Bethesda Fountain and its surrounding area. The fountain, Central Park's most iconic landmark, had been searched multiple times during the original investigation, but Emily's note suggested they should look deeper for hidden truths rather than physical evidence. The phrase, "we used to feed the ducks," puzzled investigators initially, as Emily's friends Jessica and Tyler had only met her at the fountain once, on the day she disappeared. The use of "used to" implied a pattern of past visits, suggesting Emily had a history at this location that the original investigation had missed. This realization sent the task force back to Emily's school records and social patterns, searching for connections they might have overlooked. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze Emily's note, provided crucial insight into the 14-year-old's mindset. Emily was trying to communicate something specific about this location, Dr. Hernandez explained to the task force. The phrasing suggests she associated Bethesda Fountain with someone or something significant in her past, not just the day she disappeared. Margaret Robinson, energized by the new investigation, provided a breakthrough when she remembered Emily's elementary school field trips. Every spring, her class would come to Central Park for nature studies, Margaret told Detective Mitchell. Emily always talked about feeding the ducks at the fountain. She loved those trips. This revelation led investigators to examine Emily's elementary school records and interview teachers who had supervised those annual excursions. Mrs. Patricia Wells, Emily's former fifth-grade teacher, remembered the field trips vividly. More importantly, she recalled that one of the parent volunteers who regularly chaperoned these trips was Thomas Morrison, a custodian at Emily's current middle school. Morrison had access to Emily's daily schedule, knew her routines, and had been working at the school during the period when Emily received the threatening text messages that Jessica had finally revealed. The investigation into Thomas Morrison revealed a disturbing pattern. The 45-year-old divorced custodian had worked at 3 different schools over the past decade, and each position had ended with his quiet resignation following unspecified behavioral concerns. HR departments at his previous schools had been reluctant to provide detailed references, citing legal restrictions, but the pattern suggested recurring problems with appropriate boundaries around students. Detective Mitchell's team obtained search warrants for Morrison's apartment and vehicle. What they discovered painted a chilling picture of escalating obsession. Morrison's basement contained hundreds of photographs taken during school events and field trips, with Emily appearing in an unusually high number of images. The photos spanned from her elementary school years through her current middle school, suggesting Morrison had been watching Emily for years. More disturbing were Morrison's personal journals, which documented his growing fixation on Emily. The entries revealed his anger toward classmates who bullied Emily, and his fantasy of rescuing her from their cruelty. The journals also contained detailed observations of Emily's daily routines, her emotional state, and even transcripts of conversations he had overheard between Emily and her friends. The DNA evidence from the plastic bags found with Emily's belongings was compared against samples taken from Morrison's apartment. The results provided a partial match, but forensic experts cautioned that the degraded nature of the evidence meant it couldn't definitively prove Morrison's involvement. However, when combined with the circumstantial evidence, it strongly suggested his connection to Emily's disappearance. Morrison's work schedule showed he had been off-duty on October 15, 2010, the day Emily disappeared. His apartment was located within walking distance of Central Park, and credit card records showed he had purchased plastic bags and gardening supplies from a hardware store 2 days before Emily's disappearance. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. When confronted by police, Morrison initially denied any involvement in Emily's disappearance. However, faced with the mounting evidence, he eventually agreed to speak with investigators in exchange for a plea agreement. What he revealed during his confession session would finally answer the question that had haunted the Robinson family for 3 years. Morrison admitted to following Emily to Central Park on October 15, 2010. He claimed he had intended only to protect her from further bullying by her classmates, but when Emily discovered him watching her from the woods, she had threatened to report him to police. According to Morrison's confession, Emily had tried to run away, but she tripped and fell, striking her head on a rock near the stream. "I panicked," Morrison told investigators. "She was unconscious and bleeding. I thought if I got help, they would blame me for being there. I thought she was going to die anyway." Instead of calling for medical assistance, Morrison claimed he had carried Emily deeper into the woods, where she died from her head injury within hours of the accident. Morrison's confession included his admission that he had buried Emily's body in a remote section of Central Park, far from where searchers had looked. He claimed he had later returned to bury her belongings in the location where Max eventually found them, hoping that their discovery would lead police away from Emily's actual remains. His plan had been to make it appear that Emily had been abducted and killed by a stranger. The confession provided answers, but also raised new questions about Morrison's true motives and the exact circumstances of Emily's death. Forensic experts noted inconsistencies in his account, particularly his claim that Emily's death was accidental. The deliberate burial of evidence and his years-long pattern of stalking suggested a level of premeditation that contradicted his story of panic and accident. Detective Mitchell knew that Morrison's confession, while providing closure for the Robinson family, was likely a sanitized version of events designed to minimize his legal exposure. The true horror of what Emily experienced in her final hours might never be fully known, but at least her family would finally have answers about her fate and the identity of the person responsible for their 3 years of torment. Thomas Morrison's confession led investigators to a remote section of Central Park's North Woods, nearly half a mile from where Emily Robinson had last been seen alive. The location he described was accessible only through an unmarked maintenance trail that park workers used to reach utility equipment hidden from public view. This area had never been included in the original search grid, explaining why Emily's body had remained undiscovered for 3 years. The excavation team, led by forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Chen, worked methodically to recover Emily's remains, while preserving any evidence that might contradict Morrison's version of events. What they found confirmed some aspects of Morrison's confession while raising serious questions about others. Emily's skeletal remains showed evidence of blunt force trauma to her skull, consistent with Morrison's claim that she had struck her head, but the pattern of injuries suggested multiple impacts rather than a single accidental fall. Margaret and David Robinson stood together at the perimeter of the crime scene, holding each other as their daughter's remains were finally recovered. After 3 years of not knowing Emily's fate, the discovery brought both relief and renewed anguish. They would finally be able to lay Emily to rest, but the forensic evidence suggested her death had been far more violent than Morrison had admitted. Detective Sarah Mitchell confronted Morrison with the new evidence during a follow-up interrogation. Faced with the medical examiner's preliminary findings, Morrison's story began to change. He admitted that when Emily threatened to report his stalking behavior, he had pushed her to make her stop screaming. Emily's fall had indeed been the result of Morrison's violent actions, not an accident, as he had initially claimed. The investigation also revealed the full extent of Morrison's manipulation and planning. Cell phone records showed he had been monitoring Emily's location through social media posts and had specifically chosen October 15th because he knew she would be meeting friends at Central Park. His purchase of burial supplies 2 days earlier proved premeditation, contradicting his claims of panic and spontaneous decisions. Morrison's journals, analyzed by forensic psychologists, revealed a deeply disturbed individual who had constructed elaborate fantasies about saving Emily from bullying, while simultaneously planning to isolate her from her support system. His writings showed a progression from protective fantasies to violent obsession, culminating in detailed plans for abducting Emily and keeping her in a remote location where he could take care of her properly. The psychological evaluation concluded that Morrison had likely intended to kidnap Emily rather than kill her, but when she resisted and threatened exposure, he had murdered her to avoid detection. His subsequent actions, burying her body and planting her belongings to mislead investigators, demonstrated a calculated attempt to cover up his crimes while maintaining the possibility of eventually finding Emily's remains to play the role of concerned community member. Margaret Robinson testified at Morrison's sentencing hearing, delivering a victim impact statement that brought the packed courtroom to tears. "Thomas Morrison stole more than my daughter's life," she said. "He stole 3 years of our family's existence. He watched us suffer while knowing exactly what he had done to Emily. He let us blame ourselves, question our parenting, and destroy our marriage while he continued working at the school where Emily should have been safe." The school district faced serious scrutiny regarding Morrison's employment history and the failure to properly investigate the behavioral concerns that had led to his quiet resignations from previous positions. Emily's case prompted policy changes requiring more thorough background checks and mandatory reporting of any inappropriate contact between school employees and students. David and Margaret Robinson's marriage, while forever changed by their ordeal, slowly began to heal after Morrison's conviction. The certainty of knowing Emily's fate allowed them to process their grief properly for the first time in 3 years. They established the Emily Robinson Foundation, dedicated to improving school safety protocols and supporting families of missing children. Max, the golden retriever whose discovery had finally broken the case open, lived just long enough to see Morrison's conviction. The aging dog died peacefully in Margaret's arms 2 months after Emily's remains were found, as if his final mission had been completed. Margaret believed Max had somehow known all along where Emily was and had been waiting for the right moment to lead them to the truth. The forensic evidence ultimately supported charges of first-degree murder against Morrison, contradicting his attempts to characterize Emily's death as manslaughter resulting from an accident. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never have the opportunity to harm another child. Dr. Patricia Hernandez's analysis of the case identified several warning signs that might have prevented Emily's murder if proper protocols had been in place. Morrison's pattern of inappropriate interest in students, his access to their personal information, and his history of boundary violations should have triggered intervention long before he escalated to violence. Her recommendations became part of national guidelines for identifying and managing potentially dangerous school employees. The case also highlighted systemic failures in missing person investigations, particularly the initial assumption that Emily had run away, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Detective Mitchell used Emily's case as a training example for other investigators, emphasizing the importance of taking family concerns seriously and conducting thorough searches, regardless of statistical probabilities about teenage behavior. As the legal proceedings concluded, the Robinson family finally began the process of saying goodbye to their daughter properly, 3 years after she had been taken from them. The Emily Robinson case officially closed with Thomas Morrison's life sentence, but its impact on the Robinson family, Central Park, and missing person investigations would continue for years to come. Margaret and David Robinson, now reunited and slowly rebuilding their marriage, faced the complex task of learning to live with answers they had desperately sought, but found almost too painful to bear. Emily's funeral, held on a crisp November morning in 2013, brought together hundreds of community members who had participated in search efforts over the 3 years of her disappearance. The service celebrated Emily's life while acknowledging the senseless violence that had cut it short. Margaret read from The Chronicles of Narnia, Emily's favorite book, choosing a passage about courage in the face of darkness that seemed to capture her daughter's spirit. The Emily Robinson Foundation, established with donations from the community and a settlement from the school district, became Margaret's full-time focus. The organization's mission expanded beyond school safety to include advocacy for families of missing children and funding for advanced search technologies. Margaret's first-hand experience with the emotional and financial devastation of a missing child case made her a powerful advocate for systemic changes. Detective Sarah Mitchell's career was significantly influenced by Emily's case. She pioneered new protocols for missing person investigations that emphasized immediate comprehensive searches and family consultation regardless of statistical assumptions about runaway probabilities. Her training programs, based on lessons learned from Emily's case, were adopted by police departments across the country. Central Park implemented new security measures following Emily's murder, including expanded surveillance coverage of remote areas and improved communication between park rangers and NYPD missing person units. The location where Emily's body was found became part of regular patrol routes, ensuring that no similar crime could go undetected for years. The school district's policy changes went beyond background checks to include mandatory training for all employees about appropriate boundaries with students and reporting requirements for any concerning behavior. Morrison's ability to operate undetected for years prompted investigations at his previous workplaces, leading to the discovery of additional inappropriate conduct that had been inadequately addressed. Dr. Patricia Hernandez published a comprehensive study of Emily's case that became required reading in criminal psychology programs. Her analysis of Morrison's journals and behavior patterns contributed to improved understanding of how seemingly protective adults can transition to predatory behavior, particularly toward vulnerable children who are experiencing bullying or social isolation. Margaret Robinson's transformation from grieving mother to advocate inspired other families facing similar tragedies. She spoke at conferences about missing children, sharing both the agony of uncertainty and the importance of never giving up hope. Her message resonated with parents worldwide. Emily couldn't save herself, but her story can help save other children if we learn from what happened to her. The case also sparked discussions about the media's role in missing person cases. Emily's story had been largely forgotten by news outlets until the dramatic discovery of her belongings, highlighting how cases involving teenagers from middle-class families sometimes receive less sustained attention than those involving younger children or more sensational circumstances. David Robinson returned to his construction work, but also became involved in volunteer search and rescue operations, trained in the techniques he wished had been available during Emily's disappearance. His experience with the emotional toll of extended searches made him particularly effective at supporting other families facing similar crises. The psychological impact on Emily's surviving classmates became a focus of long-term study. Many of the students who had bullied Emily expressed genuine remorse after learning about her murder, leading to enhanced anti-bullying programs that emphasized the real-world consequences of social cruelty. Jessica Martinez, who had been Emily's friend, became an anti-bullying advocate herself, speaking at schools about the importance of reporting threats and supporting vulnerable peers. Max's role in solving Emily's case inspired research into the use of victim-bonded animals in missing person investigations. While scientific evidence for dogs' ability to locate remains after years remains limited, Max's success led to experimental programs pairing family pets with professional search dogs in certain missing person cases. Morrison's conviction provided closure for the Robinson family, but questions about his other potential victims remained. Investigators from his previous school districts reopened cold cases involving student disappearances or unexplained incidents during his tenure. While no additional crimes were definitively linked to Morrison, the investigation led to policy changes designed to prevent similar cases of institutional negligence. The location in Central Park, where Emily was murdered, became an unofficial memorial site where visitors occasionally left flowers or notes. Margaret visited monthly, finding peace in the knowledge that Emily's story had prevented other tragedies through the changes it had inspired in school safety protocols and missing person investigations. 3 years after Morrison's conviction, Margaret and David Robinson stood together at Emily's grave on what would have been her 20th birthday. They were different people than they had been before Emily's death, marked by trauma, but also strengthened by their fight for justice and their determination to ensure Emily's legacy would protect other children. "She's still saving people," Margaret whispered, placing fresh flowers on Emily's headstone. "Our Emily is still protecting other kids, just like she tried to protect herself with that note." David squeezed his wife's hand, both of them knowing that while their daughter was gone forever, her impact on the world would continue through every life saved by the changes her story had inspired. Emily Robinson's case became a touchstone for missing person investigations, school safety protocols, and family advocacy efforts. Her name appeared in training manuals, policy documents, and research studies, ensuring that a 14-year-old girl who loved books and dogs would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for protecting other vulnerable children. The final chapter of Emily's story wasn't written in the courtroom where her killer was sentenced, but in the lives of children who would be safer because of the changes her case had inspired. Margaret Robinson understood that this was Emily's true legacy, not the tragedy of her death, but the lives her story would help save. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following David and Sarah's story. We'll see you in the next video.